I've spent the last 2 years exclusively working with AI coding tools. During that time, what I've noticed is that whilst the tools have got better, the standout thing is actually developers have started to learn how to use them. And so what's happened is that we've learned new techniques, developers have shared those techniques, I'm using them on a daily basis, and so this talk really is a collection of all the things that currently seem to work well. But this is changing so quickly that I've done this talk before, and if I look at the talk 3 months, 6 months ago, it's just completely different. So anyway, but first of all, what is an AI coding assistant? Just to level set everyone. An AI coding assistant is a UI, either GUI or text, that provides a very developer-centric focus over an LLM. They come in lots of different flavors, plugins for your favorite IDE, new forks of IDE, cool new IDEs. Any Z users here? Yay, good. And some cool command line ones, but they all do the same thing, okay? So I'm going to share these tips and tricks, and then I've grouped them into 3 areas. The first one is around how, as a developer, and following on from the previous session, you can use or how you can approach breaking down larger problems into smaller ones. Second one is really around actually how you craft better prompts. And then the third one, really, probably the most important one, is this evolving world of context engineering. So let's start off with breaking down complexity. The first thing that we're seeing, and this is like a kind of a new movement, is really before developers use AI coding assistants, before you actually create your first prompt, is to actually think about actually what you're doing. There's this new movement called calm coding, which effectively asks developers to shift left and spend more time. So, and I want more time, not 5 minutes, we're talking 1 hour, 2 hour, to actually really think hard about the problem that they are working on. And this helps because what it allows them to do is actually break down big problems into smaller chunks. Again, this was echoed in the previous session, okay? LLMs are really good, they're almost magical, but the mistake I see a lot of developers doing is they try and use it to do 2 big problems. They work really good in smaller problems. You have to help it find what those problems are by helping to break down. And we're seeing emerging open source tools that help developers do this, right? So you can actually, this is just one I've been using. It does a pretty good job. Again, in the previous session, they talked about building incrementally. And this is very true when using AI coding assistants, okay? Don't try and do everything in one go. It's best to break a large problem into smaller tasks, maybe using the previous tool, and then iterate and build slowly from a core and then building features on top of that. I think I've got my slides mixed out because this is the calm coding philosophy, okay? It's a GitHub repo. It's definitely worth checking out if you want to find out more about actually how you can be more intentional before you start prompting. A new emerging pattern that's, I guess, happened probably since May this year is the use of a prompt to generate a plan, okay? So you use a prompt to generate a plan, and from that plan, sort of generate tasks. I think the previous session also talked about this from a more broader perspective. But the tools are catching up. The tools now are providing opinionated perspectives on how you can do that. So how you can break down your problem into specific discrete tasks and then work from that. Actually, what I will say is that the tips I'm sharing today will work across any good AI coding assistant, okay? Whichever is your preferred, whether you're using Z, Copilot, Amazon Q, or something else, okay? They should work. I use several, and they work across all of them. So that's the first category, okay? So the first category really is all about taking a breath, catching a breath, and being more intentional. The second set are really around actually a few ideas around how you can craft better prompts. Again, focuses only on software developers, software development, not anything broader than that, because that's my own experience. The first one, which was definitely dealt with a lot of detail, is making sure that you don't go in for ambiguous prompts. It's the biggest mistake I see developers do. And what you want to avoid is prompts like that on the left, right? Which I still see, right? You want to try and pad as much detail as possible. But there is a counterpoint to this, okay? And that is that you need to make sure that you don't put any fluff in your prompts either. LLM, if you use a meta prompting to create prompts, okay, LLMs love to talk. They over-engineer. They put too many words. They put emojis, hyphens, all that kind of stuff, right? So edit ruthlessly. You can also, for example, because when these tools are being used, they generate tokens. You want to optimize how much tokens you use. So making sure that you get them to produce terse output. As a developer, I want the AI coding tool just to show me the code. I don't want the explanation. Sometimes I might, but not always, because that's going to save me maybe 50% of the tokens I'm going to use, and therefore it's going to be cheaper for me to use. When providing prompts, again, for coding, probably the most impactful way you can get good outputs is by providing good examples. What you want to avoid really is generic examples. You have to be specific. You have to provide both inputs and outputs. And because LLMs are good pattern matchers, if you provide, for example, a sample function or class that you want as a template, the LLMs will be really good at reproducing that over and over again. For example, I sometimes include things like this. If I'm creating JSON output, this is what I want it to look like. If I want error messages, or request packets, how do these look, and various other bits and pieces, right? If I put this in my example prompt, the LLM is going to use that when it's actually writing the code with the output, and my application is going to behave how I want it to behave. Again, a more recent kind of like thing that we've seen is prompts being written in EARS format. EARS format actually came out of Rolls-Royce, the engineering teams there, and it was designed to make writing specifications really clear and condense. And so this is really useful. We basically rewrite our prompts in this if, then, when, while approach, which kind of goes back to when I first started working tech 30 years ago when we used to write specs this way. But LLMs actually really like when you write prompts in this way. So EARS format, or RFC 2119, which is like another version of this, but an RFC doc, those are going to be stuff that you should look into to help you craft more succinct prompts that LLMs actually. And again, the previous speaker mentioned about developing a workflow of actually starting with a prompt, testing it, refining it, and improving it. That's absolutely critical when you're doing this with AI Coding Assistant. Your first prompt is unlikely to be the prompt you finish with. Meta prompting is where you use the LLM to actually refine, improve the prompt you've started with. And it's a very useful technique, but when you use it, so this, for example, is a prompt I started with. Again, it's detailed enough, but I can then ask the LLM to be a critic, which they're very good at, and then it will provide me some output, which I then, again, will have to refine and edit because they're very verbose, they like to talk, and I don't want them to talk too much. And there's some really good posts. I do have a QR code at the end of this presentation where I'm sharing all these things. Have your cameras ready at the end if you want to get all these links. A more recent kind of thing that I've seen a lot of developers do is shift from prompts, which are ephemeral. They live in the IDE in a moment. And whilst AI coding tools do allow you to capture histories, it's not really the greatest place to keep them. So what developers are doing is they're shifting and moving the prompts into Markdown documents and then creating simple prompts to say, read the Markdown document and start working from there. Now, as you start creating prompts within an organization, one of the things that separates good organizations from those organizations that are struggling is their ability to, as a group, to understand, learn, and share prompts that are working for their developers. No two developers are the same. They all work differently. We are very strongly opinionated people, tabs versus spaces, Java versus Python, all that kind of thing, right? And so the same thing will happen with, at least when I'm working with customers and their engineering communities, they have these strong opinions and they like to share their prompts. And so you need to develop mechanisms that allow you to do that. And you then need to figure out how you make and automate that, because the first level is actually just getting them to capture it. So put them in GitHub repos or with the project, or maybe even centralized, but then actually making them easily discoverable so anyone can actually use prompts that other people have created. And we're already seeing people, so this is from an AWS community hero who created this tool for his company, Dazen, but now is being used by thousands of people to share prompts so that you don't have to start from the beginning. We see the early precursor to this was the cursor directory, right? Which had literally hundreds of different cursor rules. But these ones are specific for actually the prompts you actually use to actually start your process. And again, you need to make sure that the AI coding assistant you use actually supports you being able to reuse prompts. So the tools I use, they actually have the ability for you to point somewhere to a shared repository. And so actually like this. So I tend to use QCLI, which is a command line AI coding tool. I can do /prompts and it'll tell me the kind of prompts that I have got available to me that I copied down from my machine. And I've already mentioned, this is just you can't see it, but this is at Amazon, we have 2,500 shared prompts in the various Git repositories. We have a 25K Slack channel where people are talking about and sharing and improving prompts. So again, as you start as an organization using AI coding tools, start trying to create those communities to help your developers understand, make aware of the prompts, but also to help improve them as well, because this is changing so quickly. The prompts in this repo that kind of started maybe a year ago and now probably very ineffective. And don't forget MCP. So actually I've got my Run MCP t-shirt. MCP doesn't just support tools and resources, right? It supports prompts. Very few MCP servers out there actually provide prompts. There are some cool projects that typically allow you to generate prompts and then regen. So every time you effectively create new prompts that make it available, but it's something you should look at as a way of making prompts available to your developer communities. And the next one, really important, if there's anything you take away from this, is that LLMs love to spend your tokens, right? It's our job to make sure we optimize for that, right? So be frugal, right? Don't overpopulate your prompts. One of the biggest mistakes I see, and I'm going to talk about this in a future slide, is that everyone initially just puts everything in, and that's not a good idea, as we'll see in a second. Right. So next one, the last one, and the most important one is context engineering. All right. Context engineering is the most outsized way for getting good output from AI coding assistants. In fact, context plus your prompt is the output you get. The prompt is important, but prompt without context will give you junk, right? And I can't underestimate that. If there's another thing you take away from this is start thinking about how you're going to learn and get good at context engineering, which is the hot topic. But what actually is context engineering? So models have this thing called a context window. And the context window it's kind of like breathing space, and it allows you to, or it's what you put in it from the point of view of your prompt, the output of your prompt from the LLM, additional files you might have as context. This all gets put into this kind of like context use part of it. And so understanding how that works is really important. I'm going to come later on to some of the issues that we're seeing in this space. And as I mentioned before, don't put everything in. Even if you've got a really fancy model that's got 1 million tokens or 2 million tokens as they're coming out now, Stanford have said that after 20K, that it doesn't do any better, right? So there's no point having a fancy million token context window, because actually that's not going to give you better output, right? What will give you better output is being absolutely ruthless in your editing and your frugality. I mentioned that this applies to any AI coding tool you're using. I use about 4 or 5, and they all manage context differently. Different capabilities, different levels of granularity, different visibility. And so what you need to do for the AI coding tools you're using, understand the different layers, okay, of how you can provide context and how you can provide and influence each of the steps. Because the AI coding tools, they prioritize certain layers, right? So if I want to make sure that I always influence it in one way, I need to understand where in that stack it lives. And all the AI coding tools do this slightly differently. So the question I get asked is, okay, Rick, what makes good context? There's no good answers, but here are some, okay? Data models are outsized in their ability to generate good context and guide AIs in a very specific path. If you're working with APIs, Swagger files are essential, right? And they make generating stub code simple, right? We can use other things as well. We can use architecture diagrams. I was doing a live coding demo yesterday. I got an ERD diagram, and I generated a data model from a diagram. If you're doing any front-end work, screen mockups can work, although beware of the capabilities that some of the vendors out there are saying you can do with it. Now, something that most people don't realize, I love MCP, but MCP stuffs your context window with junk, right? So what you've got to do is you've got to be very careful. What I actually now do is, depending on what activity I'm doing, I will create a subtask, use MCP with a prompt to generate text and ask it to put it in a markdown document and put that as context as opposed to using the MCP tool itself. I will typically save a significant amount of time and tokens in my context window, right? So this is a really good tip because I can then disable those MCP servers because they can be chatty and they can use and go through your tokens. So using these to kind of like help you optimize is like really important. And kind of this is kind of like one of the examples of how I do this. AI coding tools now pretty much all support agents.md. This is like a kind of a standard file that you put stuff that you care about, which actually from the previous talk, I was asked yesterday, there's AI for the Rest of Us conference going on at the Barbican, and I was asked in a live stream last weekend, what's the number one tip you'd give developers? And the number one tip is generate personas, right? Custom agents, we call them in Amazon QLand. But the idea is that you don't want to create, when you're using an AI, the AI is like a stateless machine. It knows nothing. So what you want to do is create a bunch of personas based on the activity you're doing. So if you're doing database work, if you're doing software architecture, if you're doing testing, create your role and then switch to that when you're doing the prompt, and then the LLM will actually have a completely different output. You can use these AI coding tools now in swarm mode, which means you can delegate. So I can have a prompt that says, I want you to start off as a product manager, generate user stories. Then I want you to switch to a data analyst and start building out some requirements, a data architect to bring the data model, and then a software architect to then start building the component model. And what will happen is these AI tools now will actually spin up these different personas, start doing the work, create the documents, and you're orchestrating that all through the AI coding tool. So start thinking about what personas you need for the work you're doing. And there are different like context engineering strategies that are evolving or emerging rather. We have the first one, which is the traditional one, which is, okay, I've got some context in some markdown files. I'm going to include that within my prompt. The next one is checkpointing, where what we do is we get to a point within our conversation plus chats, and we say, I want you to dump everything into a file, and I'm going to refer to that later on. Isolation is where you effectively decide to go down a rabbit hole. You don't want to pollute the current conversation and context, so you open up a new context window, do stuff, maybe summarize it using another technique which is not on here, and then you bring that back into your main thread. And then the compressing is where now increasingly AI coding tools allowing you to compress context to save context window, right? And what they'll typically do is use a number of different strategies to summarize the current window. And that's important because if you're coming close to your context limit, if you go over that, you'll start basically hitting what's called context rot, where you'll start getting degraded output from your LLMs. And so these are the kind of the three categories of approach: summarizing, selective, and trimming. I just talked about them, so I just won't repeat those. I've already mentioned that MCP tools are cool, but they're dangerous unless you know how they affect your context window. So if you are using them today, use them and use your AI coding tools monitoring capabilities to see what your context window usage is. Your tool should allow you to do that. If not, switch to a different tool. And then see the impact, right? And then optimize using the previous tip, which, again, frugal with what you add. What we're seeing, I mentioned context rot. These are the four principal failure modes when people get frustrated when they're trying to generate output and they think they're kind of like getting really good at context engineering. So the first one, context poisoning, is where you're doing stuff and LLMs we know to hallucinate. The hallucination enters the conversation and starts basically poisoning the rest of the output that comes through. We've all seen that, right? Context distraction is where we put too much stuff. We put everything in the kitchen sink and it just can't handle it and just goes and does its own thing. The confusion is where you like potentially put something in the context that actually is not relevant and it decides that's important, because LLMs will decide, not you, unless you maybe guide it, which is, again, another reason why you want to only put in the context what you're currently doing. Don't just, the temptation, I've seen this in tech over the last 35 years, not necessarily developers, but people above developers, they say, put everything in there just in case. Just in case. No. With LLMs, you cannot do just in case anymore. You have to know exactly what you're doing and be ruthless, okay, and optimize for the task. Dead important. And then context clash really is where you have contradictions, which can happen. For example, if I'm working with two different versions of library, they might have different API calls and one is going to clash against the other, okay? So you have to watch out for that. So just to finish, okay, we've learned a lot over the last 2 years, okay? I've really rushed through a lot of that stuff, okay? But what's coming next, okay? How are we going to make AI coding tools better for developers and actually solve a lot of these problems so that you don't have to do as much work? The reality is a lot of the stuff we're doing today is actually writing markdown documents, okay? And prompts are not really a great way of interacting or using AI coding tools to generate output, code we care about. Traditionally, whether it's initially waterfall or agile or whatever methodologies that have come after, we have traditionally spent a lot of time, reluctantly, writing docs to help us steer the code that gets created manually. But the fact is that written specifications are a really good way of aligning the developer and the customer, okay? And whilst we've started and loved the world of vibe coding, we are moving now into a new era, okay? The specification-driven era, where we're moving away from this ephemeral nature of prompts and moving into concrete specifications that are markdown documents that allow us to have lineage, so traceability from our intent, again, the calm coding, to the code that's produced, right? Because Vibe is great, it's got great use cases, and I recommend people still do that for doing things like prototyping, learning, and that kind of stuff, automation. But for production code, it just is no good, right? We need something that you can actually depend upon, you understand where it's come from. And interestingly, a side product of folks that now have started going deep into spec-driven development is it builds a better relationship from the developer to the code that's produced, right? A common issue with Vibe coding is the developers don't really know or understand the code. With spec, you have that lineage and you have better relationship because you understand where that code's come from. You see the tests, you see the requirements, you see the design, you see why it's been created, right? And that's been an interesting observation of when we work with customers, that was a surprise to us. And there are a number of tools now that provide, so Kiro is one we launched in July, but there are others, right? You've got Spec Kit, which is from Microsoft Copilot, and there's Tessel have got their own, which is still in private beta, I think. So this is a hot emerging space at the moment. But if you want to try Kiro, actually, it's no longer on a wait list. Actually, today, it's generally available, which you can try for free. And so with that, I've got, I think, 3 minutes left. Maybe not. But thank you for your time. If you want the slides, there's a short survey, and that will give you all the slides. But with that, do I have time for questions?
Yeah, I think we can take a couple of questions.
Okay. Anyone got any burning questions?
Yes, or the only burning ones.
Yeah. I will be around, though, so you can come and grab me if you want to chat about this stuff.
Yeah, in case of APIs, we have to call APIs, right? In current market, most of the models are stateless. Then we have to send the data with persona every time to the model. So it increases the input and output token. So what is the best tip to reduce both?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So the question there is, if as you start using personas and you have a prompt effectively for the persona, you're setting that every single time, right? There's no real good question. I've not seen any good answer to this other than the fact that if you don't have the persona in the first place, you get more. So the research I've done anyway, you get more output, not less, because you can influence the persona to, for example, only do certain things. So my experience has been that adding personas, whilst it does require you to use some tokens, because you reduce the tokens coming back, you still get a token saving. Whether there's going to be like persona caching or LLM side, I don't know, right? At the moment, these LLMs are stateless, and it's only what we put on the client side, on the AI, on the dev tool side, that allows us to influence that. I use Starcoder and Quen locally, and so you can see a lot of this behavior. The problem is that when you're running local LLMs on your laptop, the problem is the context window is even smaller. It's 4 or 8K, right? It's so tiny. and then they just blow up, right? So I don't really have a good answer for that, unfortunately. But it's like I said, maybe in 3 months, 6 months, things will change.
Can there be a, you can say, initial prompt or default prompt, and what is the response framework for same?
So the problem is, the problem if you do that, okay, is then you're relying on the LLM to keep that in its context window, and it may then decide that something else is more important. So so my experience is that can work, but you get variable results. And as a developer, I don't want variable results. I want consistent results.
And space for one more question.
Stupid question, but what's your day job?
My day job is I spend my time on effectively creating content on AI coding tools. So I work for AWS. So yeah, so I work for AWS and I'm a developer advocate. And my job is to help effectively developers understand how to use AI coding tools more effectively.